All right, welcome. My name is Psipher. On behalf of the Leggy group, Lambda Epsilon Gamma, I am presenting some mental health advice for the group, especially for the Howl chat for those that are interested. I do understand that given the timing, not everyone is able to come today, which is totally fine given the hour, but we are recording this for anyone who wants to have access to it. Also, notes will be available after this little lecture for people to access. There is both a handout and the original notes to this. The original prompting for this was that a lot of people have been generally struggling either with depression or anxiety, and therefore have been requesting coping skills and different techniques to be able to deal with their stresses in daily life. So what I have prepared for you today is inspired from a book called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, also known as CBT, originally inspired from Stoic philosophy. So first of all, what I want to bring in here is I mentioned Stoicism, which is essentially a form of ancient philosophy. And what philosophy does is that it provides us an understanding of the world while also being something very therapeutic or a form of therapy. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the Stoic philosophical foundations and the practical therapeutic techniques of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. But you probably might be asking, how in the world is philosophy therapeutic? Most people think of it as some type of, airheady, hot-headed form of, theoretical inquiry, right? But in general, it's actually an endeavor that brings us to a much greater theoretical understanding of ourselves and the world that we find ourselves in. And it's also about critical and clear thinking at large, but it becomes therapeutic, specifically, when we apply that theoretic understanding. We understand the nature and causes of something, we are gaining the choice to intervene in those things, such that if a person understands the nature of their sufferings, you become capable of mitigating such suffering. I know there's not many of you here in the audience, but does anybody want to take a crack at what they think it means to be stoic? Like what comes to mind?
Self-reflection.
That's a pretty good one, self-reflection. Well, does anybody
Patience
else
in
have...
the face of suffering.
Good, patience in the face of suffering. Any other ideas people associate with being stoic?
A neutral reflection of the world around you.
That's a pretty good one right there. So let's say, most people have a pretty good... People have a pretty good, strong understanding of what it means to be stoic. So therefore, those are all really good characterizations. But do you know what a stoic is as a person, probably? And I'm betting you most of you probably don't. Because most people will tend to associate the idea of being stoic with the ability to keep calm in times of stress, or again, having that peaceful form of self-reflection in those times of stress. Perhaps being able to hide one's emotions very well, or being very tough-willed. But this is a conception that is only very superficially similar to what it meant to actually be a Stoic. The Stoics were ancient philosophers that descended from the Socratic philosophy, applying Socratic thinking to ethics and how to live life. In comparison, around the same time, when the Stoics emerged, there were also the skeptics that were also descendants of Socratic philosophy, but they applied Socratic philosophy to epistemology, the field of knowledge, like how we know about things. So therefore, skepticism is a common position a lot of people are aware of, where Stoicism is more applying Socratic logic and reasoning to ethics, what we should do with our lives, how should we live well, what does it mean to live well, instead of knowing how to know as the skeptics would approach it. So real quick here as an outline, Stoicism as a philosophy provides a particular understanding about human psychology and the nature of suffering. Now this will be a major oversimplification, but I'm going to give about 3 fundamental ideas regarding Stoicism here that would be easy to digest. And there will be a question from each one that I want you to be able to reflect upon. So the first major principle is that Stoicism is a view on life as if it were produced by a human who has lived multiple lives or through repeated sufferings. From that vantage point, if you were like a very old man that looked back on your life, that you went through multiple forms of repeated sufferings, you probably would come upon a different way of tackling those sufferings. And eventually, most people kind of develop this idea that suffering is transient or temporary, and that most human affairs would look petty from a very large bird's eye view when zoomed out on human life. Does anybody have any challenge to this particular idea? Do people agree that most suffering is temporary? Like, do any of you think that suffering can be simply mitigated by imagining yourself as if you had lived a long life and that you had gone through those same issues over and over again? Does anybody want to challenge that idea?
I think maybe some diseases, or you're always suffering.
That's a good point. Like, there's forms of suffering we can't escape from.
Yeah. If your
Did you
brain
have
just
one,
wants to torture
Coda?
you.
Brain wants to torture you, like common mental health issues. So again, it's a bit of a tricky problem here. Why would the Stoics necessarily say, well, that most of your suffering can be seen as petty after a long period of time in your life if you were to reflect on it? What we're going to see here is it relates to the idea of attitude towards that suffering. There are forms of suffering you can't choose, like, if you have a broken leg or depression or whatnot, but your attitude towards that suffering can definitely be controlled. Especially if, let's say if you were like a little kid and, you got hurt and you were in pain and you would cry. As you grew up, you kind of learned to treat that pain sort of as a nuisance rather than the end of the world, right? You kind of learn, like, after you scruff your knee or something, you go, oh, it's actually not as bad as it seems. I'll get past it, because you've been through so many cuts and scrapes. You kind of learn to develop a resilience against it. That's kind of what the Stoics are kind of pointing to here in this sense, is that you kind of see some forms of suffering as a hill instead of a mountain in front of you to surmount. That's one way to kind of put it. Our second principle here is that Stoicism interprets much of our suffering to be the result of mistaking judgments and perceptions as facts, while also demanding control over events and people we have no control of. So a common example is, let's say somebody makes fun of you. Sure, it's going to hurt, but it's your perception of that person of like, well, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. Sure, they're making fun of me, but it doesn't have to affect me in any way. You can just ignore them. Same thing with general physical suffering. You can, again, if you scrape your knee again or you get hit or whatever, lose your, have your car destroyed or your house burned down, you can still choose how you respond to those events. You can either, mentally break down, or you can say, well, sure, my house burnt down, but what's the next thing I can do? At least I'm alive. My family is safe. Things could be better, that change in attitude. But does anybody still want to challenge that idea that most of your suffering is only a result of how you perceive things? Is there any disagreement in that idea, do you think?
I'm a master of self-sabotage. I get it, bro.
Well, no, you actually bring up a really good point. You actually bring up something really good there. That idea of self-sabotage is a self-inflicted form of suffering. You can't just necessarily wish that away in a sense, because even under that Stoic idea that it's just a perception, you're generating that perception and you're causing it yourself. It's something you desire to punish yourself in some way if you're self-sabotaging, right? So that's a good point. It's not easy to get around that. I'm not going to propose the solution to that at the moment, but again, I want to have our counterexamples here, but that's a very good one. Self-sabotage is not an easy one to get around. Our third one is this, not necessarily about suffering, but how do you gain happiness? How does a Stoic think about happiness, and how do we get it? Happiness in this context is something that is obtained when we are genuine, and when we have learned to not become victims of suffering as informed from our two preceding principles. But you're probably wondering, what the heck does genuine even mean? And we'll get to it a little bit later, but a general idea is living according to your values and doing actions in accordance with those values. I will flesh that out a little bit more, but do any of you folks have any challenges towards that idea about happiness being about being a genuine person? Are there any counterexamples to that where happiness could form? What do you think your ultimate happiness comes from?
Well, I think
personally,
purpose, connection. Go ahead.
For me personally, what makes me actually happy is whenever I see other people happy as well.
Okay, that's a really good communal way to think about happiness. If other people are happy, Kit. Yeah, so we got, if other people are happy around you, seeing them be happy, helping them become happy, Kit. put in that idea of meaning and purpose. There's another good lecture I can do on that that's based on Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Austrian psychotherapist that survived 4 Nazi concentration camps that also applied Stoic philosophy to help him survive in those camps, if anybody's interested in a lecture like that. I also have some notes I can share for the group. But no, Kit hit on a very strong one, that idea of meaning. If anybody's interested, I suggest looking up the concept of logotherapy if they want to see what that's all about. Buddhism, by the way, also has a very similar idea compared with Stoicism. One of the parallels, for instance, is that Buddhism tends to see suffering as being derived from an illusory ego, that your ego is not necessarily real, but that when we think we have this ego desires or grasps for things that we wish to have control over in life, where that control can't actually be obtained. Again, to be very clear on that Stoic point of view, one of the things that causes suffering, besides having perceptions of things that are happening toward you, interpreting things in a negative way, although that's a huge oversimplification, the other side of the equation here is demanding control over everything in life, demanding that everything fits according to the way you want things to unfold. Sometimes you have to let go and say, well, there are some things you're not in control of. Things will happen as they are. Go with the flow in a sense. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything about it. You should still try, and we'll, of course, focus more on that. But I'm going to ask you guys another good question. Do you all think that practice will definitely improve you? And I know that sounds like very simple. Most people would say yes, but this is a very important question. Because if you don't believe in putting in any work, you're likely not going to get better at anything at all, for quite obvious reasons. But this is the mindset I want to impart to you. Even if you only improve roughly 10 to 20%, you will still gain progress. So I want to hear from all of you. Do you think that practice, as related to coping skills, mental health, actually will improve you? As a simple yes or no. Because some people genuinely don't think so. So, okay, so yes.
Because a simple no is hard, so you have to practice.
Right.
So yes.
But I am going to ask that hard question of, do some people think that practice won't do anything? Do they think they're just doomed if it's a mental health issue? Yes, Skoda?
So technically, I want to say yes and no, because technically you could get better, but there are times where you actually could relapse.
That's a good point. But the thing is, even though people can relapse, the idea that you can still incrementally develop over time is still very important. I'll give actually a very good example here. There are people, for instance, who have borderline personality disorder. Think about borderline personality disorder as something that develops when a person is not very well validated in their life. And what happens is they start fearing intimacy in a very particular way. There's a seesaw effect where they crave intimacy, but they're also paranoid people will abandon them. They see negativity much more strongly than other people. And they're considered one of the hardest folks to treat. What you notice with them is that even in treatment, it can take anywhere between 2 and 10 years in order to keep them from relapsing, for instance, as far as I'm aware. But those that keep at it can indeed improve. And that's one of the most difficult personality disorders to actually treat. And the fact that it can be given a good prognosis and be treated is a very good sign. Stoicism, obviously, is this very ancient philosophy that goes all the way back roughly 2,500 years ago. But today, in the modern age, we have something called CBT, known as cognitive behavioral therapy, which you could take as a modern incarnation of Stoic philosophy. And many Stoic practices survived for millennia into CBT, especially into what was known as Albert Ellis's rational emotive therapy, Viktor Frankl's logotherapy from last century, and now it's evolved into CBT and also ACT therapy and DBT. They're all kind of derivatives of each other, more or less. And, you know, you can make the argument that maybe these skills have survived because, you know, of institutionalized philosophy or religion. You know, people just beat it into each other as tradition. But you could also heavily argue that they're just very practical, which, again, we'll get into roughly 8 or so skills regarding that. But how successful is it really? It's roughly, by some estimates, cognitive behavioral therapy has a 70% response rate, which means in 70% of the population that takes cognitive behavioral therapy, they get some benefit out of it. And 50% that take it have a remission rate. half of those who receive cognitive behavioral therapy have most of their depression or anxiety symptoms, at least those are the two main issues that most people deal with, you could say essentially dealt with or put into remission or cured with quotes around it. People are still going to be a little bit prone to those sorts of things. But either way, it has a very good track record. So we're going to focus on the meat. Now, there are 8 clusters of Stoic cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, and many of them overlap or synergize with each other. And you may actually find some of these techniques simple or maybe too simple, and that's totally fine. But you need to understand that a lot of these things are not necessarily obvious to everyone because everybody grows up in different circumstances. Some people grow up in a constant state of fight or flight. They don't have time to develop any of these coping skills. And also because of lack of practice, most people don't bring a lot of these ideas to the forefront of their mind without that practice. So it's okay if a lot of this doesn't seem like common sense to you, but it's also okay if a lot of you also think it's very commonsensical, but you might be surprised that you might not practice them frequently enough to actually know how to use them. And so it's pretty good to be able to consistently use these skills so you're not rusty. Does anybody here want to share why they think they personally have trouble developing coping skills if they do have any trouble doing so? Is it because you grew up in a very difficult environment? Do you think it's because of your genetics, that you're more intrinsically sensitive? Like, do you have an idea that it's not a fair balance between nature versus nurture? Who here thinks that the cards are stacked against them with regards to mental health, that maybe they think that they'll never change? Like, what is their reasoning why they think they might not change?
I got one.
You got one?
I'm a very paranoid and anxious person, and living in this world with technology and work stress and a lot of things going on all the time kind of stacks shit against me a lot.
That's a good point. So a lot of these things are very additive. You have all these stresses from your work life. You have your general, as you're saying, some paranoia that you might feel, general anxiety. Maybe some of it feels like very automatic. It's very triggering, especially people have trauma, for instance. These are things that people cannot control. But your first step, though, is awareness. Nobody's going to say that your suffering is just going to disappear overnight under therapy. It's a continuous process that you develop to manage. It's very similar, I would say, to people who have diabetes. Calling myself out here as I have it, but when you have a chronic illness, you have some responsibility into taking care of yourself, despite the fact that that illness is always there in the background. It doesn't go away for a lot of people, especially type 1 diabetes if you're born that way.
Whatever your brain's doing, you got to learn to work on it. You can't take it for granted.
That's a very good point. You can't take it for granted. You got to keep working on it. And that's why I've been asking questions of you have to have this sense of practice, this sense of moving forward, getting back up and doing it again. And yes, it's going to suck. I'm not going to lie. It sucks. But again, just like that analogy when you're a kid and you scrape your knee and it feels like the end of the world, you do develop a tolerance over time. Of course, that doesn't mean to wail in your pain and everything. You do try to solve what you can. And even again, a 10 to 20% difference an improvement is still an improvement. Okay. Finally, we're getting into the meat. All right? The things that people actually want, which will be the different coping mechanisms that people can learn. So the first idea is this concept called the contemplation of the ideal sage, which is your ideal goal as a person to become. It's usually a voice that you keep in your head. Most people actually do this without knowing it. Sometimes they have a voice of a parent or a friend or a trusted loved one speaking to them in their mind, giving them positive critique or helping them. It's kind of like the same thing as like, what would this person do in this situation? You're in a tough situation. There's a person you look up to, and you ask yourself, what would my friend or this parent or this role model do in this situation? What could I mimic from them? What are the virtues of all these different people that I have that I could borrow if I were to simulate them in my mind that I can use today to face this particular challenge? You're looking for the advice and the constructive criticism that you want that voice to simulate in your head without it being a negative criticism, which I know can be tricky, but you can cultivate this. Our second one is mindfulness, which sounds like a buzzword, right? Everybody hears about like mindfulness meditation. It's like, oh, you should be more mindful. Well, what the hell does that even mean? Like this is, again, it's a very vague notion. What we can think of it as, part of it is this concept of grounding oneself in the present moment while having an understanding of impermanence. By impermanence, I mean there are ideas, or you can take impermanence as suffering will be temporary. That, you won't be in this trial of pain forever. It will eventually pass on. And so, part of that grounding is self-monitoring as a skill. To self-monitor, what you do is you have to catch your thoughts as they are happening. You become metacognitively aware of those thoughts. Because if you do not master this, you cannot evaluate your thoughts or even begin cognitive distancing, which is another trick. So one technique to be able to do this is you need to describe to yourself what you are feeling and thinking in that given moment, or performing a body scan, feeling what it feels like in your body up and down. What does it feel like in your toes, up to your shins, up to your pelvis, into your chest? You're trying to feel the sensations in the present moment. And that'll ground you. And also, again, this idea of describing what you're seeing in front of you. So like if you have a thought pop into your mind, you say, I'm feeling this emotion of sadness. There's a thought of like, oh, will I be fired from work? Am I going to get this promotion? Am I going to get that chocolate cake that my neighbor keeps stealing from me constantly? You just plainly describe what is popping into your head in that present moment, and that'll help kind of bring you back into the present moment, into your body, without getting carried away by those thoughts. I had mentioned the phrase cognitive distancing here. And cognitive distancing, we can break up into 4 subsections here. Its general idea is you need to distinguish between subjective opinions and objective reality. When you see something bad happening to you, you need to ask yourself, is this an opinion you're forming of the negative event happening to you? Or is this an objective fact happening in front of you? Like, most people will, blow everything out of proportion and say like, oh, this is the end of the world for me. This person hates me. Well, what evidence do you have that this person hates you or that the world is ending in front of you? You need to be able to disentangle your subjective interpretation of the event versus what has actually happened in the event. A second component of cognitive distancing is that you want to see your thoughts as a hypothesis instead of being a fact, again related to what I was saying before. Treat it as like, maybe this person is angry with me or hates me or something of that nature, but it's not necessarily a fact. It's maybe, but if it's a hypothesis, you need to go get more information. A third part here is asking yourself, what am I making of my impressions? How am I interpreting this? Why am I interpreting this event in a particular negative way? And our fourth part here is understanding that the past and future are not controlled by us. Again, what I had said earlier regarding Stoicism and CBT is that there is this unhealthy neurotic urge to want to be able to control everything in order to make us feel secure, safe, have a sense that we're actually the hero and narrative of our, like the hero of our narrative in a sense that, that we're in control of everything that is happening around us. But we have to realize not everything can be controlled. We can't control everything that has happened in our past, and we don't know what necessarily is coming from our future. You kind of have to develop a sense of being happy with where you are in the present. Another thing to also keep in mind here is that when a negative event happens to you, you may have this instinct to react to it. You need to be able to develop the ability to pause and ask yourself what the long-term consequences will be of your actions and your passions if you didn't catch those thoughts. Because if you do not catch them, you're going to react immediately on instinct and on emotion without thought. You might accidentally end up hurting someone. You might say something you can't take back towards someone, right? Everybody's had a fight with someone that, that they've essentially regretted. Our third skill here is what is called self-analysis and disputation. We could also call that being one's own devil's advocate. The general idea here is you're monitoring for erroneous and irrational judgment within yourself, which of course requires mindfulness as a skill first. But the idea here is, again, seeing the events that happen in front of you as value neutral. Seeing them as just factual, just describing them, just saying like, this event happened A, B, C, D, but not adding a moral or subjective implication into it. Like, say, a person gives you a smirk perhaps at the beginning of the morning. You could interpret that maybe they're angry with you in the morning, but the fact of the matter is they only just gave you a smirk. There's no more other evidence beyond that. You can't say that they hate you or that they like you or whatever. All you can say is they gave you a smirk. But some people can be very sensitive and feel like they're being offended in some way. But you can choose not to be offended, right? So, but is there a way to cultivate this skill, to be able to monitor oneself with these thoughts? And the biggest one has been journaling. That every day it's recommended that you have a written journal where you write down your negative thoughts you've been having, the negative emotions you've been having, and even some of the negative behaviors you might be exhibiting. Some people call them tics as well. You want to write a rational response back towards yourself in your journal saying, well, I had this negative thought. Well, what would I do if I had this negative thought? Is this negative thought real? Is it rational? Does it reveal anything about reality, or is this just my opinion in a sense? Another thing you can do with journal writing is memorizing useful maxims. It's basically memorizing little phrases that help boost your confidence or help remind you how to deal with certain struggles. For instance, like saying, you can repeat to yourself, pause 5 seconds before you react, or think about gratitude for each person that you meet, for instance. That helps boost maybe positive emotions quite briefly before negative emotions spiral. Basically things you can repeat over and over again to yourself that help remind you, bring you back into the zone, essentially, and help remind you of the coping skills themselves, for instance, to keep them fresh in your mind. There's this other concept called counter-rhetoric, which again is this idea of going back to this idea of looking at the events that happened to you and describing them in plain language. Again, no introduction of any subjective or moral language. What you are doing is you're just describing things quite literally as they are happening to you and just sticking to those facts. Now, people, though, are born with a bit of an instinct to focus on the negative. This is something that cannot be easily controlled. And I want you to understand this is actually quite normal. The human mind is predisposed to holding on to negative emotions, negative memories. We sometimes selectively even forget positive memories. A lot of people with depression are like this, where they forget a lot of positive memories they've had with people, or they downplay them. They only look for the negatives. That doesn't mean they're incompetent about it. What it means is that their brains are kind of stuck in a feedback loop of sorts, but everybody kind of does this to an extent. With the thoughts that you are having, any of the negative thoughts you might be experiencing, or the reactions you might have, you should ask yourself, would you rather see others do the same as you would act? Would you feel comfortable? Would you be holding a double standard if you demanded other people to act more stoic, let's say, or more mature around you, but allowed you to have an emotional breakdown, or to feel offended, or to feel like you're having this negative judgment of reality in front of you? You want to put yourself as if you're outside your body and say, hey, is that something I want to see another person do or see myself do if I was looking at this externally? Could be your own external critic in a sense, but a positive critic at once. Now, our fourth skill is called autosuggestion, or premeditation. And it's this, again, links back to earlier with journaling. What it is any errors you've committed during the day, you want to list them, make note of them, and plan an alternate behavior of how you would have approached that particular problem, as if that, in order to bypass that error. So maybe you exploded on a friend. You got angry with them. You can go back and say, that really wasn't a very good situation. I probably should have apologized first, or maybe, I should have gently introduced the topic first. Go through your day and try to figure out what would you do to prevent those errors or to undo those errors. And that they have to be things or techniques or tactics you could use next time when a similar situation emerges. Our fifth skill is what we would call mental rehearsal, which might sound a little bit familiar to our previous premeditation, but this is going to sound a little bit counterintuitive for people. What a lot of people do is they try to suppress their thoughts, negative ones in particular. But there's a lot of research that suggests that if you keep suppressing negative thoughts, they will come back with a vengeance later. And this actually can contribute to insomnia for a lot of people, because if you don't focus on processing those negative emotions earlier in the day, when your mind is quiet at night, they will come back and haunt you, guaranteed. So one of the ways you can tackle this, if you have these recurrent thoughts, is to actually imagine the worst that can happen. And that might sound very counterintuitive, because it's like, why would you subject yourself to that? But hear me out on this. You want to imagine this worst case scenario happening in the present moment, and you allow yourself to feel those negative thoughts and emotions. Don't run away from them. And then you want to try to convince yourself that the event is not as bad as it looks or as it seems. Because at first in the beginning, it might look like you have to climb a mountain, but after a while, maybe the problem only looks like a hill after you think about all the different ways it could go wrong, that maybe it won't be as bad as you're imagining it. In this sense, it's an inoculation procedure. It gets you used to something scary. In fact, your brain does this every night when you dream. It's actually one of the theories of why we think we have nightmares. It's your brain, supposedly, or it's been suggested, that it is a way for the brain to inoculate you or acclimate you towards scary, horrible things you don't like in life, to help you prepare for how to deal with the challenge of that fear. And it also helps train you to not use avoidance strategies. It helps you to confront the issue instead of running away from it. And that familiarity is also going to make those horrifying or anxious situations less surprising and less shocking and less horrifying in general. All right, our sixth technique here is what is called Stoic fatalism, or determinism. And this might seem a little weird, but I'll hopefully try to help you make sense of it. But the idea with Stoic fatalism is that it's the idea that human actions are definitely caused by a complex network of multiple preceding factors. And by knowing that there's this giant causal web of interconnected factors, it kind of helps mitigate our anger towards other people and leads us closer to a healthier sense of understanding and forgiveness. Because, you know, everybody's kind of been in that situation of understanding, oh, well, yeah, this person had an outburst, but like this person's just a young child. They can't control their emotions yet. Or maybe you learn a person has a very particular mental disease or disorder or syndrome that they can't control easily. Now, that doesn't mean you should necessarily let people off the hook just because they have condition XYZ. You do want to feel compassionate for them, but you still want to have this sense of, okay, well, how can I help them improve while still acknowledging the fact that, yes, they're still part of this causal network that they can't control. They're still kind of a pawn of these interconnected environmental and genetic effects that we cannot necessarily escape. We have to remember that we are not free from antecedent causal factors, but as long as we are not unobstructed, we are free to act according to our nature, and thus events are co-determined, let me repeat, co-determined, by external and internal causes, meaning, yes, you have all these other factors contributing to your life that are kind of controlling you, that are causing the situation, but you need to remember you are another chain in the dominoes of causation. You're another cause that contributes to that entire causal network. You shouldn't just stand back and say, well, everything is determined and I shouldn't do anything. That's not the best way to approach it. And the Stoics never advocated that. They advocated that if you can change something and you're part of that causal network chain that can do something, then go ahead and try. But don't get mad at yourself for not being able to do everything perfectly, because you still have to obey like the rest of the web of causation in a sense. You can't control everything. And once you realize that, you can have a little bit more self-compassion and also compassion for other people. This also brings up a really important principle called Hanlon's razor, which simply states, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, which again reminds us again that we need to have compassion for when people do very stupid things, because again, people don't necessarily always know what they're doing. There are very few people that do things out of maliciousness, like sociopathy or whatever. In most cases, people do it out of stupidity. And unfortunately, the effects of stupidity do have the same effects as evil in many cases for people. It's not easy to get around, but you do treat people just a little bit better when you understand that people are not necessarily intending to do harm when they cause something negative towards you.
Sorry, stupidity or ignorance?
Well, both. Stupidity and ignorance could basically lead to situations of evil unintentionally with similar outcomes. The only difference is that a bigger issue with that is with stupidity, you can't necessarily stop it easily, but with evil, at least you know how to confront evil, right? Because you can go towards it and attack it and destroy it, but with stupidity, it's diffuse, it's everywhere, it's sometimes unpredictable. It's not something you can just stop. It's like a background, it's like random background noise in a sense, right? And again, it's one of those things you just cannot control. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try mitigating it or helping people to improve. You should still try to help people improve. But again, that idea that you shouldn't expect to control absolutely everything to make sure that the outcome goes perfectly, that will just drive you mad. Reiterating that concept, it should not be implied, one more time, it should not be implied that one should be passive to all things in life, again, just because, everything's determined. But if you can control something to improve a situation, then do so. But complaining about a situation is not actually going to help you make any progress. Because I've seen this mistake multiple times where they say, I'm going to get help, and then they complain over and over again. You want to have an action plan moving forward that sees results, that has feedback, constant, consistent feedback with people. Our seventh technique is what is called the view from above, which I briefly mentioned before, this idea of seeing human affairs as petty from a very far distance of Earth. So for instance, it's developing this sense of indifference with one's position in life by contemplating how all human life would be seen from above, such as if it was from a bird's eye view, as if you put yourself all the way up into space and were observing the Earth from above and looking at all the vastness of space and time around you and seeing how interconnected we are with everything, despite being just this little lonesome species on this blue marble of a rock that we call Earth. And then realizing that we ourselves and our possessions are finite, temporary, and transient, despite being part of this one huge eternal whole. And from that point of view, it kind of makes you focus on what actually matters and makes you disregard most of the petty and trivial matters that we tend to see with humanity as a whole in general. When you see us all as just this very fragile species, that all we have is each other on this planet, you're kind of focused to go, well, maybe I should just focus on a little bit more love and happiness and being thankful for what I have. Our eighth and final technique goes back to being genuine, or our values and our committed actions. Once again, as a reiteration, happiness can be considered found by continuously applying behavior that is in line with our values. But some people don't fully understand what this might really mean, though, because again, as I said before, it's a little bit vague. So I'll put it this way. Most people think it has something to do with goals. Like, I should have the goal of getting rich or the goal of becoming famous, and that will somehow make me happy. But goals are not the same thing as values. Goals are a means to an ends in this case. The ends should be values, while the goals are the means to obtain those values. So here's an example. Let's use wealth, as I brought up. So wealth, for instance, can be a goal. You can say, I want to become a wealthier person, maybe get a higher income. But in and of itself, desiring that wealth is not really a value. A value is something that will give you long-term happiness in and of itself. So what you do is you take the goal of wealth to fulfill a value. For instance, using that wealth to be perhaps maybe a good parent and support one's children, or to help friends that are not in as great a situation as you. You maybe have friends that, again, using that wealth idea, maybe you have a friend that's slightly richer than you that buys you a dinner every now and then, right? Or that they help buy you a new book. Maybe they help get you something that you really need. It's the use of that wealth to achieve this higher order value of taking care of another person, or maybe teaching another person. Like, again, you can have, let's take the goal of being healthy, for instance. Sure, you can be healthy, and that can help you feel better in the long run physically, but you can use that to support the value of maybe being available in the future. Because, you know, if you're sick and you die, you can't be around to support the friends that you have. If you have a value to teach someone or to love someone or to make other people happy, you can use the goal of trying to get healthier such that you will be able to be around in the future to do things for those people that you love. So that way you can achieve something that actually is meaningful. So thus, to run it home here, you want to commit to actions with the intention of having those actions conform to your values. Does that make some general sense? So that concludes most of this. I know there's a lot of information. I did not cover every single little detail for obvious sanity reasons, but for people who are interested, I do have the original notes for this lecture. I also have a useful handout that has stimulating questions to help people think about the material. It also gives a summary. That's about half the size of the lecture notes for anybody that needs them. Again, people can contact me. Dio can give contact information if they want to be able to have access to those notes. I also have other notes in process for people, for any other folks in the Leggy group, and for anybody else who's interested. I don't know who else will be seeing this. I do also have notes for social skill development for people who might feel a little bit awkward. I have some notes on Socratic method therapy, especially for cognitive behavioral therapy. I have notes, especially even philosophy and critical thinking, that people may be wanting to be interested in. I have most of my interests fall into critical thinking, cognitive science, a little bit of physics, but I do a lot of psychology research for fun as a hobby. Let me be very clear, I am not a doctor here, people. I cannot diagnose, I cannot treat you, I can lend an ear, but I can deliver resources as necessary to point you in a direction that might be quite helpful, especially for people who maybe never encountered a doctor before. I want to be able to offer resources that help create the expectations to know what it would be like to be seeing a doctor to minimize their anxiety. I've met a lot of people who are very anxious, not knowing how to get started in those things. And you know what? Sometimes some people will not necessarily need a doctor. They just need some basic starter skills for dealing with coping, to deal for anxiety or depression. If you have any questions on that, again, please reach out, and I will be able to provide notes or book recommendations in that regard. Does anybody have any general questions or any recommendations that they would like to see in a very particular in any lectures? Hopefully for those viewers that will be watching the recording in general, yes, just contact Dio if you need any further help or suggestions, or if you would like to see another lecture, or if you would just like to talk in general. I'm not always available because my schedule alternates, but I usually get every other 7 days off, so I have half the year off, so I do have a lot of availability online, but I do also have a social life, people, so if you need help, there will kind of be a line in a sense. Otherwise, thank you all for attending the lecture, and have a wonderful evening.